Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome to the 68th Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, good morning.
Paul, good morning.
It's 2 weeks since the last Moggcast, obviously, when we were speaking in the aftermath of the Owen Paterson episode. Since then, things have moved on, but I want to return to some of the themes it raised. I'd have to do a little explanation to the listeners in order to set the context. Today, that is yesterday as they're listening, the Standards Committee has produced one of its regular reports, I think, into MPs' outside interests. And there's obviously more interest in it than there was as a result of the Paterson incident and everything that's happened since. So I just want to read to you the government amendment that you moved successfully on November the 17th, just to explain what the government's attitude to all this is. And the amendment basically recalled the 2018 report by the Committee on Standards in Public Life and believed that its main recommendations form the basis of a viable approach which could command the confidence of parliamentarians and the public. So, the main recommendation in it that caught my eye, recommendation 1, was that any outside activity undertaken by an MP should be within reasonable limits. So it's this report that the government thinks could be the basis for progress. What are reasonable limits?
That is an extraordinarily difficult question to answer because people work at very different paces and in very different ways, and what would be reasonable for one would not be reasonable for another. At its very simplest level, Margaret Thatcher was famous for only needing 4 hours sleep a night. If you only need 4 hours sleep a night, you have 4 hours of the day extra over those who need 8 hours sleep a night. And are you free to do with those what you will? Or if you're a 4-hour a night sleeper, do you have to somehow find parliamentary activities to use those hours up with? So I think it's very difficult to determine what reasonable limits are, except you sort of know it when you see it.
Well, you've just said it's very difficult. Going back a step, you, on behalf of the government, basically gave the green light to these recommendations. As you said, they could form the basis for further action. And I don't think I'm being unfair in saying that one of the main elements in them is this idea of reasonableness that you think is very hard to define. So the question really that follows is, was the government really just trying to get off the hook on November the 17th? And has it really thrown itself at the mercy of a report, the implications of which it may not necessarily agree with?
Well, Parliament will have to decide in the end. It will come to a vote in the House of Commons. But I think there are elements of reasonableness that you can examine. So some people have said there should be a cap on the amount people can earn. But as we discussed last time, that would mean you could write a bad book, but not a good book. I mean, if you judge a book by sales, which seems to be a perfectly reasonable way of judging it, as Dr. Johnson said, nobody but a blockhead ever wrote except for money. And that would be silly. You could say that you could be a bad lawyer, but not a good lawyer. So if your charging rate is £1,000 an hour, you couldn't do many hours. And if your charging rate was £100 an hour, you could do 10 times as many hours. That would clearly be silly. So it's not going to be on the amount. Could it be on the amount of hours? Well, again, that's difficult because, I've got 6 children, so being with my children takes up quite a number of hours that you might say, if I were a bachelor, I could vote to my parliamentary activities. And so on hours, you'd have to be very intrusive into people's lives. And you've got to remember, as you keep on reminding people, that as a member of Parliament, you are an office holder, you are not an employee. You have to do your job to the satisfaction of your electorate. who have a choice as to whether to keep you there or not. And aren't they, the judges, ultimately of reasonableness beyond the things that need a little element of reinforcing in case lines get blurred, that people should not campaign for their own pecuniary interest?
Let's just deal with the point about hours very quickly. You dealt with the point about money. On the point about hours, I mean, let's just suppose you're a member of Parliament who is earning £10,000. If you write this has taken you the best part of a week, then the accusation will be you haven't been working for your constituents for the best part of a week. If you write that it only took you an hour, you'll be under fire for earning £10,000 an hour. So as a member of Parliament with an outside interest, if hours are the measure, you're going to be hit both ways, aren't you?
Well, no. I mean, I think if you do it in a remarkably short amount of time, most reasonable people will think, oh, gosh, you must be pretty good to earn that amount per hour, wouldn't you? I would have thought Conservative Home listeners and readers, good capitalists and free marketeers that they are, would think that somebody who has a high hourly earning rate must be pretty impressive.
Our readers might. I'm not sure the general public would. That's a different question. So, I mean, let me put it in a different way. I mean, would it be reasonable for a member of Parliament to have a well-earning outside job at the same time as being a member of Parliament if he was, say, editor of The Spectator?
Yes, definitely, because you could reasonably do that within the hours. Also, they are very compatible roles without any obvious conflict of interest.
I mean, I'm simply asking because, of course, Boris Johnson was editor of The Spectator,
You
as you were well aware. And it was not a trap that you were ever going to fall into. But the reason I'm asking is I just wonder if times have changed and what was considered reasonable in 2003 when he was the editor of The Spectator might not be considered reasonable now.
I actually think in many cases it works the other way around. Does the employer of the outside interest think that as employer he is getting value for money because being an MP is one of those jobs where you have to drop things to go and do your job as an MP. You know, there is a 3-line whip. You need to be on parade to vote. You need to be there. And you can't say, well, I'm not going to be there because I'm meeting a grand fromage.
Who's going to decide what is reasonable?
Ultimately, the voters will decide, but they may, whatever systems we have to come up with, there is one great, large, independent body that judges whether what is done is right or wrong, and that's the British people. And that is much more important than any other structures that are set up. That's fundamental to our democracy. It is important to maintain their confidence in the system between elections, and at elections they will decide. If you look at the 1997 election result, that was hit very badly for the Conservatives because there was this view that the government was sleazy. That judgment was made. We were weighed in the balance and found wanting. And John Major had set up all sorts of committees, done all sorts of things, but actually that hadn't really impressed voters. What people need is to have confidence that things are being done properly and that MPs are on their side. And that is shown in all sorts of ways. And if MPs do it well, they will seek re-election successfully, and governments will seek re-election successfully. And that is the judge I'm most concerned about, my voters.
But between you or an incident or another MP and the voters is the regulator, whoever the regulator might be. There's the Commissioner for Standards, Jonathan Evans, who does a different job, is calling for parts of the bureaucracy to have greater powers of investigation. So some of your colleagues will say, well, hang on, we don't mind our constituents deciding whether or not we're acting reasonably. But why should we, Conservative backbenchers, why should we, Leader of the House, please tell us, put ourselves in the hands of these unelected bureaucrats?
Well, the Prime Minister's been absolutely clear that the judgment on who is in the Cabinet is with the Prime Minister, not because of any other reason than democratic accountability. The Prime Minister has a democratic mandate, and you cannot hand that over to a bureaucracy. Indeed, Lord Evans' own report said It's very rare I have a pre-prepared quotation for you. And I think this is the first time I ever had, but it was so striking that in case we came onto this, I kept it. They said about having a further independent body, the concentration of such power to a body without an elected mandate and without the checks, balances and accountabilities of elected politicians seems disproportionate and does not sit well in our democratic system. But ultimately, this is about democracy. And I would challenge this idea that independent bodies of non-elected people are ipso facto more high-minded, more honest than elected people. That if you want to talk about interests, we had this fantastic letter from the cabinet secretaries, didn't we, saying we should do this, that, and the next thing. How many of those went off to take jobs in the private sector? How many of those got quite nice jobs once they'd left being cabinet secretary, well paid from merchant banks, etc., etc.? Why do we think they are the most high-minded and that the politicians are not? And you see, I would rather things are determined by those who are accountable rather than those who have deemed themselves to be saintly.
You read that quote from Jonathan Evans, you were well prepared. Jonathan Evans did suggest greater powers for the regulator, though, didn't he? Greater powers to initiate investigation, if I'm right.
But it seems to me that this sentence is in contradistinction to some of his other recommendations, and it may be that I am highlighting the bit that I think is most powerful, but democratic accountability is fundamental. If an independent regulator does not like the behaviour of somebody the Prime Minister has appointed, to whom is that regulator accountable? Nobody. On the other hand, the Prime Minister is accountable to Parliament between elections and to the electorate every 4 to 5 years.
Let's just cut to the chase of what's at the bottom of much of this, not about ministers, but about MPs more broadly. Is being an MP a job?
I don't think it is. I think it is legally, it's office holding, but I also think it's a vocation. That I think the whole hours thing is completely misleading. That as an MP, if you were to log your hours, you would be working much more than a 40-hour week. But it doesn't seem like that because what you're doing is so interesting and you want to be doing it and you want to be out and about in your constituency and you often are doing things, are they work or are they not? And if I go to a village fete in Somerset, which is one of my favourite summer activities, with all my children, I will spend most of the time talking to constituents. Is that work or is that fun? Well, I love doing it. If I weren't an MP, people wouldn't be coming up to talk to me who I didn't know, but because I am, they do. And if there are things that need to be followed up or surgery meetings that need to be arranged, I very often have my agent there who can sort out the bookings immediately. But I don't, when I go to Village Fete, think, gosh, I'm going off to do this terribly hard work. I think, aren't I lucky that I'm going to have this interesting afternoon? So I think what is those lines about makes drudgery divine? Being an MP is not drudgery. It is really interesting, enjoyable activity that is different from an employee-employer relationship job.
Do you think it's possible, given that there is a ban on paid advocacy, to extend the bar so that there is an automatic ban on paid consultancies?
Well, I think MPs and peers should be very wary about the roles that they take on and how they conflict with their political interests. And this is in many ways a matter of honour as much as of regulation. I think this particularly applies to people who leave office as to what should they go on to do. And that, isn't it Pompeia, Caesar's wife, who should be above suspicion? And I think politicians should want to, of their own volition, avoid those grey area conflicts.
Changing the subject, I just wanted to get your sense of what you difficult question, this. What you think the public mood would be were there to be further restrictions in relation to this coronavirus variant? I simply ask because reading a certain amount of commentary in the centre-right press, including, I dare say, on Conservative Home, the view is people are fed up with it. Whereas the point you've been making in these Moggcasts for a year and a half or more is the government wouldn't have been able to have these lockdowns if they didn't command popular consent.
I think that's always been true. I think one of the things we should be very proud of is that this country has done it by consent. It hasn't had aggressive enforcement. It hasn't been issuing vast numbers of fines. We haven't had a policeman on the corner of every street, which on the continent they have had. And people have volunteered to accept these restraints and have done so because the government has consistently gone with the grain of public opinion. And I think it is really important that the government continues to go with the grain of public opinion, which has evolved. That if you go back to Easter 2020, people were very frightened about COVID. It was unknown. There didn't seem much treatment for it, and there certainly wasn't a vaccine in the short-term horizon. So that was a very different atmosphere from now, when I think many people are coming to the conclusion that COVID is something that we've simply got to live with. And so you may stop flights coming in from a country with a new variant. You may ask people to wear masks under certain circumstances, but you recognise that fundamentally we are living with this in the way that we live with seasonal flu, we live with colds, we live with all sorts of other illnesses that afflict people. We don't shut down the whole of society. And I think this is something that officials, the government, everyone is aware of, and you can only put restrictions down if they go with the grain of the nation.
Just finally, did Nadine Dorries really write to you in the following terms in the days of the coalition? Dear Mr. Rees-Mogg, you are an F blank 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 wit, as reported in the Times.
I didn't see that report. It was mentioned to me by my mother. Nadine is brilliant. I'm such a supporter of Nadine's, and I have no interest in raking up old correspondence.
I think we'll leave it there.
Thank you very much.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.